Welcome to another episode of the Runs Produced On Air podcast. This is Nate Kosher, and this is episode four of the Runs Produced On Air podcast. As you recall, this is produced on Substack. You can subscribe and listen and also read my work on Runs Produced or listen on Spotify or Apple. And today I'm excited to announce I have Larry Schechter here with me. He is a fantasy sports expert and an author of the book, The History of Fantasy Sports and the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen. So we're going to talk to him about his experience playing fantasy sports and find out a little bit more about the book, just because it sounds very interesting to me as a fantasy sports player myself. So, first of all, Larry, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So with the book itself, I of course thought you probably are a fantasy sports playing person yourself. So when did you start, and how did you sort of get into fantasy?
I started approximately 1990 or 92, something like that. I was driving around Boston and I heard an ad on the radio for something that turned out to be a fantasy baseball league.
Okay.
And I called and was immediately interested and signed up. And my story there is like probably one out of 10,000 because the 99.9% of people who play fantasy sports, they heard about it from a friend or a coworker or some company advertising in sporting news. So
Right.
hearing an ad on the radio in 1990, that's very unusual. And we also did that draft by a conference call, which was also very unusual.
Funny. So you didn't probably know anyone else in the league, you just thought it sounded fun and
Yeah,
called in.
yeah. Yeah, and they actually went out of business. I can't remember if it was after the first year or the second year, they went out of business. So then I had to look for something else. And I looked through the sporting news and I found the CDM Diamond Challenge and started playing that, which also led to me playing fantasy football.
Was my next question actually, if you have a favorite sport to play or a preferred sport that you participate in?
Well, I like baseball and football. I played basketball for a while also, but that was just kind of too much, especially when the seasons overlap.
True. Yeah, baseball. I like baseball myself, but I know some people just the length is a turn off, and you
Yeah.
really have to stick with it the whole season, which is the fun of it, I think. But uh, for people, fantasy football sometimes seems easier to stick with.
Yeah, it is easier. Um, And especially, I've never played baseball with daily moves. Some people play daily moves. That to me is crazy. It's like enough work to do moves once a week, but I would never want to be in a daily move fantasy baseball season long league. Although some people love it, so that's fine. If you like it, fine.
That is pretty intense. And the pitching changes and pitching injuries that occur over the course of the season. So do you have a preferred league format that you typically play in?
I typically play in base baseball. I play in a couple of auction leagues, and I play in snake draft leagues. CDM was salary cap. So I played salary cap
Okay.
for a long time. I don't play that anymore. But I'm
That's
I'm in, I'm in two baseball experts leagues, Tout Wars and Labor, and those are auction formats. And
okay.
football's just snake draft.
So I've heard about the Tout Wars. Could you tell me a little bit about that and explain what that is?
Yeah, well, but with some of the stuff we're talking about here is covered in my book, The History of Fantasy Sports. It covers everything from the precursors of fantasy sports right through everything, current day. And one of the things that you were just talking about is the grind of a season-long baseball season, and that's part of what led to the rise of daily fantasy sports. There's a chapter in the book about daily fantasy sports, and one of the big appeals of it is that you can just play daily. You don't have to commit to 6 months for football 6 months for baseball, 18 weeks for football, or 6 months for basketball. You can just play, a couple of days here and there if you want, whatever you want. So
Hmm.
that concern is one of the reasons daily fantasy sports is so popular, especially among younger people. And there's a chapter in the book about experts leagues, and the first really well known one was the USA Today sponsored Labor League, and they just decided to get people who are regarded as experts, a lot of writers and industry people, to promote it. And Tout Wars was sort of an offshoot from that league, and it's been going for many. They've both been going for like more than 20 years. Um,
Oh
the
wow.
Tout Wars meets in New York City every March to do their drafts live.
So it's redraft every year you have a new team
Hmm.
using the salary cap draft.
No, those are options.
Oh, an auction, sorry, auction draft.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. They're redraft.
So as long as you mentioned the book, I was gonna get to that next here. So obviously you're a veteran of fantasy baseball, football, but what inspired you to write this book covering the history of fantasy sports?
Well, for many years I would look around. I mean, when I started in 1990 or 92, whatever it was, now most people had never heard of fantasy sports, and reports would come in the mail. There was no internet, no, it's just, primitive compared with what is today. And now it's like you have fantasy everywhere. You got millions and millions of people playing everything from fantasy football and fantasy baseball to fantasy cricket, fantasy Iditarod. You've got 24/7 Sirius XM radio channel. You got fantasy experts. You turn on an NFL game or any pro sport, and you see fantasy information. So for a long time, I would look at this and I go, like, how did this all happen? How do we go from the idea for a game like this to where it is now? Nobody's ever written a book like this. The story has never been told. You can research little bits and pieces of it, but nothing
Mhm.
comprehensive at all. So I thought somebody needs to do this. This is something that's needed is how did this all happen? So I decided I would do it. And my idea was I'm going to write a book, The History of Fantasy Sports, who did what, when, how did it all happen? Very early on, when I started to research and talk to people, I started hearing some really interesting stuff, some fascinating things, some humorous things, some inspirational things. I realized very early on I can write a book, The History of Fantasy Sports, who did what when, how to happen, that'll get the job done. It'll also come off as a very boring research paper.
Mhm.
Or I can really focus on the stories of the people and what they did that are the stories that are interesting and funny and nobody has ever heard them before. And it'll get the job done and also be very easy to read and very interesting. And that's what's happened is the subtitle of the book is this and the stories of the people who made it happen. So the reviews have been fantastic because people say it's easy to read, it's fascinating. Even people who've never played fantasy find it interesting because of the stories. You don't have to play fantasy to find it interesting. There's stories of entrepreneurs who built
Sure.
this whole industry.
Yeah, I was reading about it on Amazon actually, and some of the reviews and content, and it looks like, it's been very well received. Is there a specific way if people want the book, should they go to your website or where should they buy it?
Well, Amazon is the easiest place. That's got lots of details and reviews. It's available paperback and ebook. If you don't like Amazon, though, it's available on most booksellers' websites, paperback and ebook.
Okay, great. Yeah, I wanted to make
Or
sure I got
if you
that in
want,
there.
if somebody wants an autographed copy, they can sell me $5,000.
That's another option.
Yeah,
There you go. So, as you said, it's a wide-ranging book with a lot of, I'm sure, colorful characters and people. But to go back to the very beginning, if you could just give us a short summary, how did it actually all begin, and what was the first league, or what became
yeah.
eventually, I guess, formal?
Well, there were, there are precursors that go back to like tabletop games in the 1800s, and then games like All-Star Baseball, board games, and Stratomatic and APA, and um, so there's actually a lot of interesting stuff about even like Stratomatic and some of the precursors. But the main difference in like what I would refer to as modern fantasy sports is it's based on professional athletes' performance for what hasn't happened yet. Whereas something like Stratomatic is based on professional athletes, but what they did last year or prior seasons.
Okay.
So the first and where the first real league like this was a guy named Bill Winkenbach, who was a 10% owner of the Oakland Raiders. In the late 50s, he had primitive games, fantasy games for the PGA Tour and for baseball. And he was the owner of the Raiders. And in 62, they the Raiders were playing in New York against the New York Titans, now known as the Jets. And when they flew to New York for the game with some of the other people on the plane, he mentioned his games for golf and baseball to a couple people, and Scotty Sterling was one of them. He was writing for the Oakland Tribune at the time, and they said, "This, hey, this is great. Why don't we do this for football?" So they stayed up all night talking about it, and they created a game for football. But the season in '62 had already started, so they had to wait to '63 to start it. So '63, they launched their fantasy football league, which is the first really official ever fantasy football league, which was not called fantasy football. They called it GOPL, GOPPL, um, Greater Oakland Pigskin Prognosticators League or something like that. It's in the book. I don't remember the exact wording. Um, and they kept it, but they kept it amongst themselves. They wanted it to be only for people involved with the Raiders. So it didn't spread. But a guy named Andy Musolimus was in that first league. And after a couple of years, he owned a bar in Oakland. And after a couple of years, he decided it would be good for business and fun to offer the game to his patrons. So he did. And it was immediately really popular. And the next year, they had a second league, and then a third league, and then a women's only league. And people would come to the bar and they would see this and they'd be like, what is this? And then they would want to play. And
Great
before
business
long,
move.
yeah, it was a great business move. It was great for business. Before long, people from bars all over the country were calling him, asking, like, what is this game? What are the rules? And he's the guy that really started to spread it. And what's really interesting, I spent 18 months of full-time work researching. I interviewed dozens and dozens of people. I spent hours and hours researching. And when I'm reading about, Bill Winkenbach and Andy Musolimus in the first football league, I would read like article after article after article, and I'm reading the same stuff like 30 times. But every once in a while, there'd be like a new little piece of information I hadn't seen before. And what was really interesting was after reading probably 20, 30 articles about this, all of a sudden I see this thing that hadn't been mentioned before. Andy Musolimus was a war hero. His his spreading
Oh, very
fantasy foot
cool.
his spreading fantasy football was like irrelevant in his life. He when he was 17 when Pearl Harbor happened, and he volunteered for a unit that was going to go behind enemy lines, and the recruiter said 97% of you are not going to return. He did it
Wow.
anyway. They gave him a
Wow.
cyanide pill, so if he got captured by the Germans, he could kill himself. And obviously he survived. And when he was in his 90s, his mission was top secret for like years, and it was finally declassified years later. When he was in his 90s, he went to the White House for a ceremony in honor.
That is crazy. That's the
Yeah,
type of thing I imagine you wouldn't have any idea you'd uncover when when you started this project.
yeah, no, it's like everything I looked at, like I would keep finding these things like, oh my God, this is amazing, or oh my God, this is so interesting or funny. Like I just and I knew this book is going to be great. Like these stories are so amazing. That it's like I'm not I'm not creating anything amazing. It's the stories that I'm hearing and what happened are amazing.
So at the beginning you mentioned, everything from Iditarod leagues, and it even started out, with golf and other sports. So what is the most obscure or extreme example of a fantasy sport that you've heard while researching this book?
Well, there's several. Near the end of the book, I show a list of every sport that I've heard of. In researching the book, every fantasy sport that I heard of, I put a list of them all. There's more than 50. And then after publishing the book, I've heard of a couple more since then. Because like fantasy Iditarod is very obscure. Um, Sumo wrestling, Bachelor, the TV show The Bachelor.
Yes, I
There's
have
people
heard
play fantasy.
people
Yeah,
do that.
yeah. And Fantasy Congress.
Oh, interesting.
Fantasy,
Who's gonna get into like collecting
it's
these, gonna
Fantasy
make it?
Congress. Like okay, you can take Ted Cruz and Rand Paul, and I'll take Alexandria AOC, whatever her name is,
Hmm.
Ocasio-Cortez, and I'll take, Chuck Schumer. So we take Congress people and senators, and they get points for various things. If they sponsor a bill or co-sponsor a bill, you get points. If they speak on the floor of the Senate or Congress, you get points.
That's funny.
And and if they vote against their own party on a bill, you get bonus points.
Wow.
And it's not real. It's not, there not aren't, millions of people playing this game or even thousands, but it is a game. Some people play. But it's biggest with high school civics classes. That's who mostly
Oh,
plays it.
oh, oh yeah, that's interesting. I suppose it is a way to learn about what they do and their
Definitely, yeah,
jobs.
definitely, definitely.
Oh, that's funny. Um, so as you've probably seen in the news here recently, the NBA has a situation on its hand with gambling, and
Yeah.
as fantasy has grown over the past few years, legalization of sports betting has occurred. And obviously, not all fantasy leagues are for money. Some people just do it for fun and for the love of the game. But now, sports leagues have leaned into this market with partnerships and sponsorships. So, how do you see this playing out? And is it possible, for pro leagues to find the balance here? Can they figure this out, what they have in their hands?
Well, I think you're talking about a couple different things. Like as far as the recent scandal, I think that's because of the legalization of gambling that they can uncover these things. The Chauncey Billups and Emmanuel Clase. It's because it used to be illegal, so there weren't people watching, unusual betting patterns and discovering the sort of thing. But there's in the history of fantasy sports, one of the big questions over the years was, is fantasy sports gambling? And, there's a couple of chapters in the book about legal issues. And going back all the way to that very first league, the very first Bill Winkenbach league, and the Andy Mussolinis and his bar, they played they played for 10. Well, they would have like a league would be like a 10-cent league. That meant excuse me, that meant if there are 10 teams in the league, if it's a 10-cent league, if I score a point, I get 10 cents from the other nine owners. And,
Yeah,
then they had like, or maybe they had like, and some were like 50-cent leagues. So, but they called them
interesting.
points instead, but they called them points instead of cents because they didn't know if maybe one day the vice squad was going to raid the bar.
Sure. So they were already thinking about that even in the
Yeah,
beginning.
people just didn't really know is this legal or not. Um, and it turned out there was um, in the 80s there was a firehouse in Fort Lauderdale, Florida that got raided that was running a fantasy league, and in Austin, Texas, there was a restaurant that was raided, and these people were put on trial for, accused of gambling. So it finally got settled legally, that fantasy sports is legal. But it had to go through like the federal government issued a ruling on it. Every state has issued rulings on it. It's been like a long battle. Um, and even now, though I just said it's legal. Well, it's legal in like 45 states, but 5 states it's still illegal.
Hmm. Yeah, I didn't know that. And I never knew it had to go through those legal hoops. But it's interesting. Smart of them, I guess, to be aware of it in the beginning.
Yeah, and
Uh, s-
another big legal issue is whether or not fantasy companies can use player stats, or if you have to pay rights to the NFL or the MLB or whatever. And that was another huge battle that
oh, sure.
fantasy won. And if they hadn't won, I mean, what we have now would be completely different.
Yeah. Wow. Um, so once again, just want to thank you here. I'm getting to the end here, probably wrap up the interview shortly, but couple more questions. So as you were writing the book, what was your biggest takeaway, I guess, if you could narrow it down to, just a couple of eye-opening things.
Yeah.
And then secondly, do you have anything planned next, or any other projects you want to talk about?
Um, well, a couple big takeaways from the book. One was just that the the people that created this industry, they were all entrepreneurs. Like when fantasy started, these are people who saw something, they saw something that was needed and didn't exist, or something that existed but they thought they could do it better. And that's how all these various things we have now were created. Like, for example, Ian Allen, Ian Allen, who runs the oh my God, what's the name of it? Fantasy Football Index. Ian Allen, there's a very big magazine. You may have heard of Fantasy Football Index.
Mhm.
Ian Allen and Bruce Taylor, when they were in college at the University of Washington, they're college students. They started playing fantasy football, and they said, this is great, but there's no information. Let's start a magazine, and that's how that started. And other people started other things. It's the same thing. So it's like all these entrepreneurs have created everything that we have now. When computers came around, some of the early computer people said, gee, we could use this for fantasy sports. Commissioners spend 10 hours a week doing the statistics by hand. This new computer thing can do this really quickly. So they started
Yeah,
statistics services. Um, one of the first ones was a couple in Pennsylvania, Jim and Gloria Berger. And they did statistics for baseball and basketball. And what you had to do then, this is like about around 85, for baseball, you'd get the Tuesday USA Today, had the American League statistics for the week. The Wednesday USA Today had the National League statistics. So Gloria would read the statistics, Jim would enter them in the computer, they'd calculate the results, print out reports, and mail them to their clients on Wednesday night.
wow.
And one Wednesday, Gloria went into labor with her first child. They did not let a little thing like going into labor stop them.
That's
So
a commitment.
in between contractions, Gloria read the stats to Jim. And then she'd be like, oh, wait, here comes another one. Hold on, hold on. Okay, it passed. And she continued.
Oh,
And
that's
so
hilarious.
they got the reports out on time Wednesday night, and their daughter was born that afternoon. And now, 38 years later, the daughter that was born that day plays in a fantasy football league with her dad.
That's absolutely wild.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, though, yeah, two things that are takeaways. One is, as I mentioned, that these are all entrepreneurs that create things, and the other thing that I had no idea was going to end up being like a theme throughout the book is fantasy sports builds relationships like incredibly, like, between coworkers, parents and child, um, high school and college friends that would have drifted apart over the years, but they're still together
Yeah.
because they play in a fantasy league, or even that also applies to like Stratomac and Apple leagues. Um, so the relationship building from fantasy is just incredible. One of the guys I interviewed, Mark Mariani, was with CBS Sports and Turner Sports, and he's actually the guy that was responsible for first getting fantasy statistics showing during NFL broadcasts. In the NFL broadcasts, they would show the scores,
Mhm.
Packers 7, Bears nothing or whatever. And
Yeah.
he kept telling them, look, they're now, lots of people playing fantasy. They need to know who scored the touchdown. He kept saying this. Finally, one day they said, all right, they started putting this information on. But anyway, the thing about Mark Mariani is when he got his first job in sports in Chicago, and they invited him to be in a office fantasy football league, and he had never heard of fantasy football. But he he realized when they told him about it, he realized, wait a minute, if I join this league, I can call my boss's boss in the fantasy office in Manhattan, and he'll take my call to talk about a trade or whatever. A guy who, ordinarily in a million years would never take his call. So when he realized that, he joined the league.
Just any FaceTime could
Yeah.
be beneficial. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. Also there's drafts in Las Vegas where you have like a plumber sitting next to the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and they're talking like they're best buddies. So, fantasy is just, it's incredible for relationship building.
Yeah, definitely builds community and keeps people connected, as you said, that
Yeah.
you otherwise probably would lose track of. So yeah, I guess then this has been very fascinating, and I think this is a book I'm going to need to order myself. Do you have anything else planned, any other related projects in the pipeline?
No, none. I think this is it for books. I think this is something that it didn't exist. It was needed. I want everybody to read it. That you'll love it. Anybody who plays fantasy sports will love it. It's also a great gift. You can give it to your league mates or whatever. It's like you can't do that with a strategy book. You get a good strategy book or a good strategy website or something. You want to keep that to yourself.
Yeah,
But
yeah, don't share
but
that.
this is something you can share with your competitors.
Well, that's great, and yeah, that that kind of brings the community and fun to it. That'd be a nice gift maybe for
Yeah.
commissioners to consider. Well, Larry, once again, thank you. I appreciate your time. I found this very interesting. And so if you haven't, go out and order Larry's book. And otherwise, I just want to say thanks again for being here. And this has been the Runs Produced podcast.